IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Ananya Desai, and I'm here today with Aditya Ramanathan, Research Fellow at Takshashila. In today's episode, we will be talking about the policy of mandatory conscription, its trajectory so far, and what adopting or abstaining from it would mean for India. Now, India has never had conscription in its independent years, and joining the Indian Armed Forces has been voluntary. But Article 23 of the Constitution does allow the Union government to mandate conscription in order to secure the nation's interest and the public's broader well-being. But this constitutional loophole has not been brought into practice, not yet at least. Conversations about conscription in India were heightened after reports since 2008, which showed a lack of recruits for the army, especially those who were suitable to become officers. And this shortfall could arguably pose a national problem. So, Aditya, why do you think military conscription has not been mandated in India?
Thanks, Ananya. Actually, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is a practical reason, and the other is customary or historical. The historical reason is simply that India really doesn't have an experience of conscription. Really, I mean, so firstly, obviously, there have been forms of conscription throughout history in the past, in pre-modern times, where, for example, you had taxes on communities where they're supposed to send some of their young men, some portion of the young men, to serve with some lord. But really, conscription, as we understand it, starts with the French levy en masse, 1792, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. At that time, India, while the levy en masse was going on, it had three armies: the Bombay, Madras, and Bengal armies. These were all volunteer forces in the three presidencies of the East India Company. And you had various other armies, the Marathas and so on. And all of these are based on pay and voluntary service, right? And really, since then, India has never had any form of conscription, even through the First and Second World Wars. We've always had voluntary service. There've been inducements and sometimes social coercion for people from certain communities to join the armed forces, but we've never had that national service. So while we have it, the provision in our constitution, we don't have an experience of it. The second, I think, is simply practical. I don't think we see the need for it. I don't think we see that it solves the problems that we have. If you were to increase the size of India's armed forces, who would be the officers for them, right? I mean, we have a problem we have an officer shortage or officer recruitment problem, even with the voluntary armed forces that India has at present. So where would you find those leaders? So I think that's the practical issue. And I think those together explain largely why India doesn't have conscription. All of this can change the moment you have some major national crisis where the existence of the state is itself at question. So that's why Article 23 exists. It's for those very rare contingencies.
You mentioned social coercion or persuasion. Just a question, would you attribute that to, say, NCC?
No, I meant it in the sense that people would, for example, in the First World War, from certain communities, be shamed into volunteering for service, saying, look, everybody else from your village is gone. What are you doing there? Right? But it's still, nobody's putting a gun to your head. It's still voluntary.
Okay, fair. Now, switching from volunteer recruitment to conscription and vice versa, it's been quite rare around the world. Between 1969 and 2008, there have been 41 transitions to volunteer recruitment, but only 18 to conscription. What do you think could be the reason for this?
I mean, I think the reasons are broader historical trends. I mean, again, just to go back to what we talked about, the origins of conscription, right? I mean, conscription really begins in the form that we understand it today, like I said, with the French Revolution. And I mean, if you read the original text, I love this bit of text. It says, henceforth, until the enemies have been driven from the territory of the Republic, the French people are in permanent requisition for army service. The young men shall go into battle, the married men shall forge arms and transport provision, the women shall make tents and clothes and shall serve in the hospitals, the children shall turn old linen into lint, the old men shall repair to the public places to stimulate the courage of warriors and preach the unity of the Republic and hatred of kings, right? So this is sort of the beginning of conscription as we understand it. And really, once the French started issuing, instituting national service in whatever form that it could. Remember, this is still largely a pre-industrial society, but in whatever form the state could institute it, what you saw was that other states instituted in response, not Great Britain, but several of the other continental powers in Europe. And really, through the 19th century, a lot of European countries had conscription on and off. So there would be times when they turn it off. But it was a normal form of mobilizing the people for large scale or what they would call general war. Now, this obviously reached its peak in the conflicts between 1914 and 1945. And in fact, you not just needed conscripts because you needed to increase, you needed a large number of people serving at one particular time, but it's also because conscription was used to create a large body of reservists. And so, you would be liable for service for 1 or 2 years, and then you would be, for example, you could be liable for conscription until the age of 35, 40, 45. These rules kept changing, but basically the idea was that at a moment of crisis, you will have a large body of reservists on whom to call upon. This started to change after 1945 slowly. I think part of the reason was simply the international system at that time did not require or did not anticipate large-scale land wars. The other reason is social, which is that a lot of people were just fed up with national service, and you saw resistance to national service in the UK and, of course, in the US during the Vietnam War. And connected to that, I think there is also if you are, for example, fighting wars of, decolonization, or you're involved in wars of choice like the US was in Vietnam, conscription becomes very unpopular. Conscription, you can get political support for conscription when there is widespread support for a particular war effort. When that consensus breaks down or doesn't exist, you are likely to see much less support for it. And states are in greater habit of using voluntary forces for these so-called wars of choice. And finally, there are technological reasons. The most obvious technological reasons are basically increases in mechanization and firepower. The most dramatic example of firepower is nuclear weapons, which can do a lot of destruction that would in previous generations require humans to do. But also other types of long-range artillery, air power, all of these things were basically forms in which in warfare we started substituting labor for capital. And so that required, in general, much fewer people. So, for example, when the Americans issued this threat of massive retaliation in the event of a Soviet incursion into Western Europe, by massive retaliation, they meant that they would escalate to nuclear weapons. Now, this was done precisely because the US did not want to expand its conventional forces at that time. Of course, the threat of massive retaliation didn't work, and Americans had to invent something called flexible response and so on. It's not so simple, but you can see how a combination of the international system, social factors, and technology come together to basically make conscription both less viable and much less popular.
And the idea of mandatory conscription, how do you think it impacts the effectiveness or the quality of the military?
Oh, absolutely, it does. The short answer is it does. The instructive example here is the United States, which after after the end of the Vietnam War in 1973, basically moved to creating an all-volunteer force. And that all-volunteer force, you had much higher degrees of training. You had higher standards of recruitment. And this was needed because the US military at that time was also embracing this major technological revolution that involved information technology, communications technology, precision-guided munitions, and all of this. So basically, the idea was that you would have smaller number of highly trained people who were there in the military for a long enough time to both have the training and later gain the experience to use the machinery that they were using effectively. So there's definitely been a transition from quantity to quality in that respect. Now, this does vary and change in different time periods of human history. So, this isn't linear. There might be a situation in which we might find humans going back to some form of national service, but as of now, we are still very much in the era of preferring a smaller number of well trained and experienced people who know how to use the complex systems that they operate.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
All right. Now, as I mentioned before, Article 23 of India's constitution provides a clause allowing the union government to mandate conscription. Do you see this being implemented in the near future?
No, I don't. Short of a major contingency, at least I don't. Now, the kind of contingencies that India faces don't necessarily require large numbers of personnel. So, for example, you have conflict on the LOC with Pakistan. Pakistan also has entirely voluntary forces. In fact, the evolution of its armies is of course very similar to India, and the armed forces actually of both countries have many commonalities. And so, you don't really need conscription with a Kashmir contingency. And even if you have a wider war, unless it involves in some way the fundamental security of the Indian state in a way which cannot be guaranteed through its other larger conventional forces and its nuclear forces, in that case, you might find, the need for national service. So, just entirely wild speculation here. For example, if you have a massive systemic collapse in Pakistan, and you need large-scale intervention with boots on the ground from India, that's the sort of case where in the future you might need national service. In the case of China, you primarily have threats on the border, where you can't really deploy large numbers of people, and you want to deploy machinery as much as possible, and you have a maritime threat. And navies and air forces don't really care about conscription because they want a smaller number of people who have training and experience.
Okay, that's fair. Now, states with more consistent or intense threats to international security are more likely to impose mandatory conscription, like we see in South Korea. And this implies that the decrease in interstate war could help explain the decrease in conscription post World War II and post Cold War. Do you think the same logic can be applied to India with an aggressive China and an army driven Pakistan as neighbors?
Again, I think this really depends on where. What happens to the international system and what happens to India's problems with these two countries, right? When I say the international system, I mean, you have had at least a period of decline of large-scale interstate wars. And I suspect that has a lot to do with, the fact that you had two superpowers and now you have one major superpower and only one sort of rival, China, to it. If those circumstances change, you could very well see a sort of a resurgence of interstate wars in the future, and we don't really know what form that will take. However, I don't see that happening in the immediate future, and I don't think that India's problems with Pakistan and China as they stand today require in any form conscription. In fact, conscription would get in the way of doing that. But yes, there are countries for which conscription or national service is useful. You had mentioned South Korea. That's a perfect example. Finland is another example. Singapore, which doesn't necessarily have immediate threats right now, but it instituted national service in 1967, at least for males. And that continues to this day. Switzerland is another example. Doesn't face immediate or obvious threats, but national service is again for males is mandatory, and again, all of these countries are able to draw on a large number of reservists in the event that there is some contingency in the future. So I think for small countries, it is relevant, and it is useful to have a large number of reservists. And to have reservists, you need to have some sort of national service so that people have some basic training and know what they're doing. But for a country like India, no, not at all. So in fact, it's quite the opposite, right? So when the government introduced the Agnipath scheme, at least anecdotally from every armed forces person that I've talked to about this, they're opposed to it because they believe it doesn't give enough time for personnel to gain the training and experience they require to really do their jobs, right? So we are very much in a world of voluntary service using highly trained personnel.
We have this popular debate going around about whether we live in a multipolar world or we live in a bipolar world. Some would even argue it's unipolar because we have one state actor calling the shots. Which of these three do you think would mandate conscription the most?
I think not a unipolar world and not a bipolar sort of world, but I think a multipolar world where you don't have any major powers around. I think, to my mind, that is this sort of circumstance in which you are likely to see a resurgence in interstate conflict and the need in some places for reinstituting national service.
That makes sense. Now, those proposing military conscription often cite reasons like national integration, discipline, unity, etc. What do you have to say about this?
Uh, so I don't necessarily buy it. I think that if you were to look at the experience of conscription in a lot of these smaller countries, for example, uh, that's not necessarily the reason they're citing. They're citing national security threats. They're not really talking about national cohesion, and a lot of conscripts, are naturally unwilling. If you talk to Singaporeans who have done national service, anecdotally, most of them will make fun of it and talk about what a pain it is. So it doesn't necessarily do that. And if you want to create some sort of national mission or some sort of sense of unity, you can create other forms of national service that don't have to be military. So, for example, in the early 1960s, the Americans started the Peace Corps, in which Americans could go out for sort of gap year in college and do some form of civil service in another country. And basically, the idea was that you would make friends in those countries. It was a form of civil or public diplomacy. And I think that sort of national service, or being involved, for example, if you are skilled in something, if you're a civil engineer, being involved in providing a civil infrastructure in rural areas, that sort of thing, that sort of national service makes a lot more sense than having, and people should be incentivized for that. Having that sort of national service with not necessarily making it mandatory, which is, I think, counterproductive, but making it voluntary and giving people incentives to do that, I think that makes sense. I think you would be hard pressed to find many people in the armed forces themselves who would support conscription, because just finding the right people who qualify is hard enough in a country like India. And the idea of increasing that recruitment base is not something that most people in the military would welcome.
Within India, a popular argument for conscription is that it'll improve the patriotism or in nationalistic fervor in its citizens. Do you think this overemphasizes the role of patriotism in a civilian's life? Like, why do you think one necessarily needs to have this nationalistic fervor to be considered loyal to their country?
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a political question, and there's some amount of subjective value judgment in this. My view is that I don't think that military service by itself necessarily makes us more patriotic. And I think there are other forms of service, like I mentioned, that we can look at. The other thing is that there are practical reasons why you don't want to necessarily have conscription. One factor that limited recruitment and conscription in the 19th century in European states was, perceived political reliability. Now, these were obviously authoritarian states, which were obviously concerned about some populations. They believed, for example, people in urban areas to be politically unreliable, too infected by, too infected by socialist ideology and so on, whereas people from rural communities were considered to be simple and straightforward and patriotic and so on, right? So there will always be differing perceptions about political reliability, and I think that can get in the way of conscription. The other thing is that the other way it can be counterproductive is that privileged people and people in privileged positions of power and so on can always find exemptions for themselves. It'll be much easier for them to game the system, and people who don't have that kind of social or political capital, or literally just capital, may not be able to get themselves out of national service. So it can be seen as inequitable, and these don't increase patriotism. They actually can potentially decrease it, and can actually decrease social cohesion, increase fissures. The other thing is, I think in a diverse country like India, there are existing social and cultural and linguistic and religious fissures. And India's political parties have no interest in papering over these or reducing them. They survive and thrive by exploiting them. In those circumstances, do you really want conscription? Do you really want to train a bunch of people to carry out organized violence when you have these divisions within your society?
All right, now this is my last question for the day. Do you think that Indian military's technological advancements and capabilities have any impact on India's policy or stance on conscription?
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, one of the reasons that people from the armed forces, rightly or wrongly, oppose the Agniveer scheme is precisely because they believe you don't give people enough time to train and gain experience in using high-tech platforms, high-tech weapons, and so on. And absolutely, that makes a huge difference in how the military sees the value of conscription, or rather why it doesn't see a value in it. And given the fact that India is likely to, its aspiration at least is to move to theater commands and to, potentially increase the budgets of its Air Force and its Navy, I see very little demand side from the military for expanding the base. In fact, if anything, most people in the other two services besides the army would actually like the overall number of personnel in the Indian Armed Forces to go down.
Yeah, you also mentioned that the military would prefer to put machines rather than officers, like in areas of border conflict.
Oh yeah, I mean, so for example, in the border in the Himalayas, you do want to automate as much as possible, right? Because that's not a hospitable environment. It takes a lot to support people in a remote area. In general, the armed forces will welcome automation.
All right. Thank you so much, Aditya, for joining me today. It's been a great conversation. And I think it gives a pretty holistic view of what conscription would mean for India, why our policy is the way that it is. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we will see you in another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.